I'm Steve Larson with the Hoard Dairyman magazine. We welcome all of you out there to our webinar this month. It's not the 36th webinar we've had. We had a month with a couple of them, I think. But anyway, we're completing 3 years of our webinar series. And today we're very happy to have with us Joe Lauer from the University of Wisconsin, who's going to be talking about corn growing, how to get yields and good quality corn here in the northern Corn Belt and around the country. I'm sure your comments will apply to a wide range. And the webinar today is brought to us by the Kuhn Company. We appreciate their sponsorship and their support. And I also welcome and thank our co-host Mike Hutchins down at the University of Illinois and Jim Baltz down there, who assists him with the technical aspects of our webinar series. So with those comments, Mike, turn it back to you and have you go ahead and introduce our presenter today.
Well, very good, Steve. Great to be back online and good to have a nice turnout again today. And our thanks also to the Kuhn Company for their support. It's my honor and pleasure to introduce a good co-worker, Dr. Joe Lauer from the University of Wisconsin. Joe grew up in Staples, Minnesota. I've been in Staples, Minnesota. There's railroad tracks up there, Joe, I believe. And
That's right.
Then he went on after and got his graduate degrees at the University of Minnesota in the crops area. Then from 85 to 94, he went to the University of Wyoming and saw the light. In 1997, came back to the University of Wisconsin and is on a 75% extension, 25% or 20 or 25% research appointment and has gone through the various assistant, associate, and professor ranks. He's got a whole plethora, that's a big word for me this morning, a plethora of awards here. Certainly the CAL's Pound Extension Award is a very powerful award given by the College of Agriculture there at Wisconsin, and then he also received the 2002 Ag Research Award. So, Joe, we're so pleased that you could work us into your very busy schedule, and we'll turn you over. Your title here is Growing High Yield and High Quality Corn Silage, and Dr. Joe Lauer, the program is yours.
All right. Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Steve, and good morning, everybody. I try to keep this kind of informal usually. If there are some burning questions that people have, feel free to ask me, and I can usually answer them quickly and get back on track oftentimes, but we'll see how it goes here a little bit. What I wanted to do today was talk about just growing high yield and high quality corn silage in the northern Corn Belt, and I think a lot of what I'm going to talk about today certainly pertains to the northern part of the U.S., southern part of Canada, but I think some of the things as well pertain to a lot of other areas, and I think you might find some of the principles useful. Of course, most of the corn silage is grown in the northern part of the U.S., Wisconsin, Minnesota, New York, Pennsylvania, New England states, Vermont, Maine. All those are very important corn silage producing states for the dairy industry, and so a lot of this data I think will be applicable to various parts of the country. What I want to do is first of all talk about some corn silage yield and quality changes that occur over time. I want to talk a little bit about the corn energy pools that we see within corn silage. And then I want to spend a little time on just what I would call the top 10 management factors that go into producing high yielding, high quality corn. And then finally finish up with a topic that every year we wrestle with, and that's this whole idea of the value of corn silage, especially when we have tough growing conditions. There's a lot of fields that are bought and sold between grain producers and dairymen, and getting a handle on some of that value of corn silage is, I think, a real challenge for our growers here in Wisconsin, and I would bet elsewhere around the northern Corn Belt. So that's kind of the plan today, and we'll kind of work our way through things here a little bit. I guess the first thing we'll do is ask a poll question. We're seeing in Wisconsin more and more apps and spending more time trying to develop apps for people that have smartphones. And I'll turn this over to Jim here, but do you use a smartphone? And if you do you use any University of Wisconsin extension apps on them?
Okay, the polls are now open, and
Well,
I think we should
interesting.
be able to vote quickly here. This should be an easier vote. They're going to get a lot tougher. So, Steve, are you voting?
Yeah,
I know my answer. It's no.
I have, yeah, I no, I actually do have a smart. I know how to use it, but I have one, a smartphone, and and it does a lot of things for you. If
Okay,
you can
we're
just get some grandkids to help you run the darn thing. So, yeah, it looks like voting's going very fast here this morning.
Yep, we're up to 66% of the vote. So at this point, Jim, we're going to close it off. And Joe, can you see the answers? Can you
I
see?
do. Yeah.
Okay, you want to
Everyone's
comment?
everyone's using smartphones. That's great. Not many Wisconsin extension apps on it though. So
A lot
I
of
think this
potential
is,
there.
yeah, right. I think this is pretty typical. We've asked this question with our meetings for a number of years, and this number continues to rise. We used to ask whether or not farmers use computers, and then it was the internet, and now smartphones, and many people are migrating to smartphone technology for a lot of different things, and we're looking at trying to develop some apps. And if you have any good ideas that we can use to get our data out there with some of these apps, we're always interested in trying to develop them. So with that, we'll move on here a little bit. I guess what I'm going to do here is start with just what do we want in a corn silage, and this is kind of old thoughts, but it's certainly appropriate still today. Paul Carter back in 1991 kind of asked the question, what makes a good forage? And these 5 reasons were given: high yield, high energy, high intake potential, high protein, and then the proper moisture at harvest so that you could store it. And with the exception of protein, corn silage actually does a pretty good job of fitting the bill of what makes a good forage. Of course, the ultimate test is how well that forage performs within an animal. And if we want to evaluate many of the treatments that we put out typically every year about 3,000 to 4,000 plots of corn silage. And if we were going to try to estimate how each one of those plots would do through a dairy cow, it'd be very expensive, and we really couldn't even try to do it. So what we use for our basic model for predicting the performance of hybrids or row spacings or plant densities, we use a model called Milk 2006, and this is kind of the 4th iteration that we've got now with this. It was developed by Randy Shaver and Eric Schwab, and we use this for evaluating a lot of our corn silage recommendations that we make, and you'll see a lot of data using this Milk 2006 model. Of course, when we look at corn silage is really consists of 2 major parts. One is the grain and the other is the stover. It's roughly about half and half, grain and stover. Generally, the grain is about 80 to 98% digestible, and that's a function of really a lot of different things: kernel maturity, particle size, some of the endosperm properties. When we get to the stover side, again, it's about half of the dry matter is stover, and only about 40 to 70% of the stover is digestible, and that is really a function of the kind of hybrid that you've got, whether it's BMR or not. The lignin and also the maturity will also influence how much digestibility you'll have in that stover. Now, there's a lot of different discussion about the kinetics of how you model and look at corn silage digestibility. Some people say 24, others 30. Everything that we model is 48 hours, and that's basically to get at the potential of the maximum potential that we can have with the corn silage treatments that we put out there. It may not be real world or realistic, but it does describe pretty much the exact or the potential energy that you can get out of corn silage, and so that's what really our model is based on as we work through this through these different examples here. Well, let's start off with just looking at some of the different plant parts here, and we'll start with the stover. There are right now what I would just call extremes in stover. There are the beefy, or the BMR versus the leafy, or normal or transgenic hybrids that are out there. The BMR are basically hybrids that are really a unique critter out there. It was first discovered in 1924, the BMR genes, brown midrib genes. There are now 4 different genes available. BM3 is what's been traditionally used quite a bit, but there are some others that are working their way in. Basically, what this is characteristic of it is that you have a brown midrib on the corn plant. Usually associated with this trait is less lignin, higher digestibility. One of the things that we have struggled with here in Wisconsin is we typically see a yield penalty with growing brown midrib corn. It ranges anywhere from about 15 to 20%. So we usually have a little bit lower yielding, but the quality is always off the charts in terms of cell wall digestibility and that sort of a thing. So the effects of the brown midrib are somewhat unpredictable in real life, but we do see tremendous benefits with high producing cows and high forage diets, and I'll talk a little bit more about this data in a little bit. But again, very different kind of a divergence that's occurred with corn silage over the last 10 to 15 years, and BMR is really in a category all by itself. There are a number of factors that will affect the stover energy pool, or the NDFD energy pool that's out there. We've already talked about BMR corn. Legumes versus grass versus corn silage, each one of those will affect that stover pool a little bit. Stage of maturity is also will also influence how much energy you can get out of that stover pool. Generally later, more mature forages will be less digestible. Cutting height, climatic conditions, how well it fermented, but it's very clear that there is a big impact on milk production as far as NDFD, or the stover energy pool, is concerned. Oba and Allen in 1999 published the fact that for every 1% unit increase in NDFD, you get more intake and you also produce more milk, about a half a pound of milk for every 1% unit increase. So these differences that occur with this part of the energy pool in corn silage really kind of come down to the value as perceived by the dairymen. Many dairymen don't feel it's that important right now, but I think it comes back to a little bit of just how many tons do you handle. You can probably handle and be a little more efficient with corn silage that has high energy in that stover pool. But again, we generally don't worry about it too much, and but as you handle and haul more, it becomes more expensive as you get poor quality silage, and usually that poor quality can oftentimes come from that NDFD portion. Okay, so that's on the stover part. On the dent, or on the grain part of the pool of energy out there. Most of the energy, of course, comes from the endosperm, which is that white floury part of the endosperm, and that's really where a lot of the starch and again a lot of the energy comes from. We do get some protein from the germ and things. One of the big things that, of course, Randy Shaver's been working on has been this vitreous endosperm, which is kind of on the shoulders of the kernel, and that tends to be a little bit harder type of an endosperm, which can make it somewhat difficult for rumen bacteria to get access into and do the digestibility of it. In general, as you go north in the corn belt, you tend to have more and more vitreous endosperm because we have more of a flint background in those northern hybrids that are grown. And so again, this becomes more of an issue as you go kind of north. But again, starch, more starch that's available for digestibility will increase milk yield. Some data by Firkins et al. Published in 2001 show that as total starch tract digestion increases, you increase milk yield. But again, this is influenced by a lot of different types. The Flint versus Den type starch polymers in the endosperm, whether those kernels are hard or soft, how much processing goes on. Kernel processing has really allowed us to cover up a lot of the sins that we used to have with letting corn go too long out in the field and get too mature. By breaking that kernel up a little bit, you can reduce the particle size and allow that bacteria to get into those kernels for energy absorption in the cow. So again, all these things influence the amount of energy you can get out of the stover and starch pools. Okay, so now what I'd like to do is switch gears a little bit and start talking a little bit about some of the factors that influence high quality and high yielding corn silage. Of course, we got to start with number one being the weather. And we're in the northern corn belt challenged quite a bit more, I think, than other parts of the U.S. because we're oftentimes dealing with wet springs and in the spring, and then dry, hot conditions during the month of August. Now, certainly a lot of other people deal with these as well too, but the cool, wet springs really are a challenge, and we really saw this last year in 2013. We had tremendously late planting dates, and that has influenced a lot of our corn management as we've gone through this particular growing season. Of course, you got to know what you need to have out there, and what I just say, what you need to pray for ideally. Basically, corn likes temperatures and that you and I like. 50 to 86 degrees temperatures can be very comfortable for us, and they're also very comfortable for the corn plant. Once corn gets above 86, or once weather or temperatures get above 86 degrees Fahrenheit, that corn plant actually begins to shut down and almost stops growing by the time it gets into the mid 90s or so. So warm weather is good. I mean, to some extent is good, but once you get above that 86 degrees, it kind of slows down a little bit. Of course, spring, you want to have a dry enough spring to plant early, but you got to have it yet wet enough to activate herbicides and promote good stands and uniform emergence. And then in the fall, you'd like to have actually cloudy, mild weather is not so bad of a thing for corn silage because that will tend to slow down the dry down a little bit and allow you to time that harvest a little bit better out there. And usually we're ready to go to harvest corn silage around the 15th of September. But as you'll see in a little bit, this can vary quite widely as we look at a number of years of data. Now, if there's one slide that I'd like to have you come away with today, it's this slide here. I think this slide here kind of in one graphic tells what goes on within that corn plant as we try to manage this crop, and especially as you try to sell it and try to get some value from it in the fall of the year. Corn silage, like all other forages, around that flowering time has very good forage quality as measured by milk per ton. You know, around that flowering time, tassel, flower time, R1, we have very good corn silage, and like all other forages, corn silage goes down till about the milk stage of the kernel. Beginning about the milk stage, the forage quality actually increases with maturity, and by the end of the season, by the time it's mature, we're actually at better quality at the end of the season than we were around that flowering period. Very unique in the world of forages. Again, this quality comes on because of all the grain that's being filled during this time. And again, we see some excellent quality out here at just before black layer. If we would let this go a little bit longer, quality actually comes down a little bit, as well as yield. as measured by milk per ton, milk per acre. And it actually comes down a little bit out here. But this pattern is important to think about as you start to wrestle with the yield and quality changes that go on during development. So oftentimes, like this last year, we have late planting, and by the time frost comes, we might be only this far along, at the R5 to R5.5 stage of development, and we're giving up quite a bit of yield and quality out there if we have some early frosts that occur or some late planting dates. So again, this is kind of a fundamental aspect to growing corn silage. All right, a little quick question before we head into about hybrids here. What type of corn silage hybrid do you purchase for most of your acres? And I'll turn it back to Jim here.
Okay, well, we're off and running. Polls are now open, and Steve, get ready to vote here. I know which one I'm going to pick. You have you have 5 choices here to start voting, and the votes are coming in quickly. We're almost at 20%. Must have a lot of Republicans online since Wisconsin, kind of the Paul, the Republican. Well, we'll move on. You're from your governor. I guess I've said enough. Conventional, transgenic, leafy, BMR, and silage Pacific. Steve, any comments?
Well, and those of you out there that play primarily an advisor role, you can reflect what either what you would recommend or what most of your clientele is doing.
Oh, we got some real thinkers now. We're slowing down.
Yeah, right.
We don't have all day, you Republicans. Let's go here.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Well, that's it. We almost at almost 2/3. Let's close the polls, Jim, and turn it back to Joe. What do you think of the survey? I would have I would have lost, but we'll move on.
Well, I think there are again, what's happened over the last 20 years has been a lot more silage specific kinds of hybrids that are available out there, and those specific hybrids, I think, oftentimes have a softer kernel. Now, whether or not that means anything to the dairy cow because of our kernel processing that we got out there, I think that is certainly a researchable topic. The BMR again is typical. It seems like either you go BMR or you go leafy. These results don't surprise me, although I am surprised a little bit, I guess, by how many are selecting the silage-specific group. That's kind of interesting. So, all right, interesting. Okay, well, let's keep going here then. And what I'd like to do next is just talk a little bit about selecting hybrids in what I just call the transgenic era here. We used to, for years, recommend to growers to select hybrids based on multi-location data and consistency of performance. The criteria used to be, of course, for grain is yield, moisture, and lodging. For silage, it's always really been yield, but now there's a lot of differences out there for milk per ton and also milk per acre. These, we feel, are the most important things for selecting corn hybrids. Since the transgenics have come along, we have recommended 3 more criteria. One is to pay attention to seed costs. The seed of corn seed is quite different in their costs, anywhere from $125 to $150 a bag, all the way up to, $250 to $350, or it's been talked about even going as high as $500 per bag. Generally, what we see is when you have a difference of about $50 to $75 per bag, whether it's $500 or something else, that difference of $50 to $75 a bag is what you got to pay attention to, because it's really hard to get more yield to pay for the more expensive seed when that difference is more than that $50 to $75 a bag. So we have some decision things that you can use at that website there that might help you with that decision. Another thing is that every hybrid must stand on its own for performance. Oftentimes hybrids right now are bought and sold based on families, but if you've got kids, that one kid is very different from the other. They each have their strengths and weaknesses, and again, every hybrid's got to stand on its own for performance rather than by family. and then finally buy the traits you need. In northern Wisconsin, we don't need the corn rootworm trait in many fields. I think everybody needs a corn borer trait, but that corn rootworm trait we can oftentimes manage by rotating fields and doing other things, and you may not need that trait. But I know it's easier said than done because industry is kind of forcing us to go that way. The important thing here, I think, is to remember that traits do not add to yield. These transgenic traits don't add to yield. What they do is they protect yield. Why would a Roundup Ready trait or why would a corn borer trait add to yield? What they're really doing is protecting yield. And that's, again, a fundamental thing to keep in mind as we evaluate these transgenic hybrids. Our criteria for selecting corn silage hybrids are yield first. I like to have good grain yield as well because that allows some flexibility. If you want to leave a field go, you can leave that field go and harvest it for grain if you want to. Silage quality is also important. I used to have this about 5th or 6th on the list here, but again, there's some real differences in terms of silage quality among hybrids that are out there. Generally, you can grow a little bit longer season hybrid compared to the grain hybrids that are grown in your area. You don't have as much risk with those longer season hybrids, and every day you can add to your maturity, you increase yield. And on the grain side in Wisconsin, basically we increase, for every day later season, we increase grain yield 2 bushels to the acre. So with silage, we don't worry quite as much about the frost date, the kill date out there, and so you can generally grow a little bit longer season hybrid to take advantage of a little bit higher yield. Standability is important again because it allows flexibility if you want to leave that field go for grain, and then having good pest resistance is also important. Know that there's a lot of variation for silage yield and quality among commercial hybrids. We test about 350 corn hybrids up here in Wisconsin every year, and the range is quite broad in terms of their performance. Okay, now what I'd like to do is turn to some data that was put together by Randy Shaver and others in 2001, and basically looking at the influence of the brown midrib hybrid versus a control. And the control is typically a standard hybrid. So we've got the control hybrid here, the BMR hybrid over here, and basically what we've got is everything's pretty similar as far as dry matter, starch, and NDF, except for the NDFD values. So what we've got here is a hybrid that has very high energy from the stover pool, okay, with the brown midrib hybrids, okay. And when we feed this kind of corn silage, and again, I'm just trying to show you the influence of what quality does on corn silage or within dairy cows. With the BMR, you get greater milk intake. You have a little bit higher milk production, a little bit lower fat, and that sort of thing. But really here, this is the important thing here. Almost 5 pounds of milk per day difference between the BMR hybrid and the control hybrid. And again, this just is an example here of what forage quality can mean in terms of quality within a dairy cow. Okay, another quick poll here. Jim, I'll turn it over, or Mike, I'll turn it over to you, I guess.
Okay, well, let's see if we can get these Republicans voting a little bit quicker here, Steve. What is the most important agronomic trait for your corn silage hybrid now? And Joe's kind of giving you a little bit of a view on that. We'll see if you've convinced them. Forage yield, grain yield, transgenic traits, relative maturity, forage quality. I know which one I've picked, and I'm raising my finger to Jim so he knows I wouldn't want to cheat. Steve, have you decided which one you're voting on?
Yeah, I'm raising my finger too, but nobody's watching.
Nobody's watching. Patty's not there to monitor?
No, she's got her back turned to me.
Okay.
So anyway, yeah, the votes are coming in here pretty good. I'm a little surprised maybe by the results.
I am too. I'm losing again.
Are you?
I'm losing again. Unbelievable. Well, we're 2/3 there. Let's close her off. And Joe, any comments on the voting?
Yeah, I lost too. I would have voted for forage yield. because yield still drives so much of what we do out there. But again, I think growers are, especially dairymen, are paying more and more attention to forage quality, and so I think it'll be interesting to see how this goes down the road over the next 10 years or so, because one of the things that I think is going to happen is we're going to see more and more hybrids that have now transgenic traits that have differences in forage quality. We're seeing the first transgenic trait coming out in alfalfa for quality this next year, and I'm sure there'll be more in corn as time goes on here, and we'll see kind of how this holds down the road. But for me, yield is always important in growing a forage, so I was surprised. All right, so let's keep on going here. In my mind, for the dairymen and the growers in Wisconsin, the two most difficult decisions growers have is selecting a hybrid, and number two is timing that harvest. Again, this year we saw a very extended planting season. We have a lot of custom choppers that come through, and so growers really struggle with being able to time that harvest properly. If you're too wet, you'll have lower yield. You can get souring and seepage. If you're too dry, you can get mold developing. And really, you kind of go along and manage that field as best you can and take the season that's coming to you. But in the end, what really drives the decision for timing that harvest is the moisture that you have to have it for that storage structure. Okay, and generally the storage structures are a little bit different. For a bag, it's 70 to 60% moisture. A horizontal bunker is about 70 to 65%. Concrete stave is about 65 to 60%. And an oxygen limiting silo is about 60 to 50%. Okay, so what we recommend is trying to time that harvest using the kernel milk stage as a trigger. And what we mean by a trigger here is that once the kernel milk stage gets to, if you're putting it into a horizontal bunker, once it gets to about 80% kernel milk, then at that point you should go out and measure your crop for moisture. Okay, so once it hits about 80% kernel milk, you go out and do a dry down, see once where that moisture is for that field, and then make your decision and adjust accordingly. Generally, it takes about it dries down at about 0.5% per day, but it varies by the year. Here are 6 years from Manitowoc County from 1996 through 2001, and you can see 2 years where if we were targeting a bunker, we would have been at 70% moisture by the end of August, and we would have been past the optimum moisture by about the first week in September. Okay, generally we recommend harvesting around the 15th of September. In most years, or 97 and 2000, we would have hit that about right. But then we'd have some other years like 96 and 2001 where it took us all the way almost till the end of September before we got to the proper moisture for storing in a bunker. Okay, so environment really influences this. But what's interesting is that the rate of dry down is pretty much the same. It's around, we usually figure about 0.5% per day, and you can see these years here was 0.4 to 0.7%. You do see some years where there's a rehydration that occurs. This is often due to a fairly heavy rainfall that kind of rehydrates those plants a little bit, slows things down a little, and but then eventually you're back down to this similar slope or similar rate of dry down that's occurring out there. So again, about 0.5% per day is what we typically measure. We use these triggers because, for example, if the harvest window is for a bag silo is right in here between 70 and 60% moisture, we hit that at about 80%, and we're out of it by about 40% kernel milk or so. But this is the window that we're trying to target. The interesting thing here, though, is that we'll have some hybrids that will be way too wet. Each one of these dots is a hybrid in a field, and we'll have some that are way too wet. So you really have to do a dry down. That variability is much too great to take the chance in terms of putting corn silage up into a bunker or into a storage structure. You really have to do a measurement, do a dry down to figure out exactly where you're at, and 80% kernel milk is where you'd start for a bag or for a bunker. So these are our in-season guidelines for predicting corn silage harvest date. Note the hybrid maturity and planting date of the fields intended for silage. Note the tasseling date. It's something that you can just see very quickly driving around looking at your fields. Generally, it takes about 42 to 47 days after silking. Now, tasseling is usually about 2 to 3 days ahead of silking, but it's 42 to 47 days after silking that you'll be at about 50% kernel milk. And you can use that to help time that field out there. Once that kernel milk line begins to move, use those triggers to find out where you are at about, and then figure about 0.5% per day to predict the date when that field's going to be ready. You can use all of these things here to help time a custom chopper that's coming along, or time your own harvest out there in the field. And then once you're in field, you can do one more thing, and that's just adjust your cutting height to be able to adjust that moisture a little bit, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But these would be the in-season guidelines for being able to predict when that corn silage harvest date occurs. Okay, so moving on. Number 4, planting date. This is priceless, and we saw it this season. This sets up your whole season. And what I recommend to growers is don't worry about temperature. If we worried about temperature in northern Wisconsin, we wouldn't be planting corn until the beginning of June most years. It's more important, I think, to look at the field conditions. And if the field conditions allow you to be able to get into the field, then I would go ahead and plant if it's after April 20th. Generally, in Wisconsin and the northern corn belt, the optimum date to plant is somewhere between about May 1st and May 7th. But also know that there are crop insurance requirements. You can't plant too early or you won't be able to cover your field with crop insurance. So know what those are, be aware of those. But certainly after April 20th, in the southern part of our state, Wisconsin, the northern part, it'd be about April 30th or so. You need to just be planting as fast as you can, as fast as you can go. These last 2 years have been 2 years of cases in point where what happened with the early planting dates. In 2012, we had very early planting dates. We actually planted our plots in March. And then this year we had extended planting dates where we didn't finish planting our fields for our research plots this year until July 3rd. So there were some real extremes over these last 2 years, and that's really, again, kind of sets up your season. This is some data from Heather Darby, who's now in Vermont, but basically she looked at some corn forage responses to planting date. You can see what happens with forage yield as you get into the end of May. You see a lot of decrease in terms of tonnage that goes on. What's interesting here, I think, is that NDFD doesn't really get affected all that much. It only went from about 59 to 58%. It was significant, but it doesn't really get affected too much. And when you think about it, the plant or the stover part of that plant usually gets to be about the same size regardless of the planting date. What really gets hammered, though, is the grain yield. And you can see what happens with grain yield as you get into the June planting dates. That goes way down, and that ultimately affects your yield. Milk per ton goes down a little bit, and of course milk per acre goes down quite a bit as you get into those June planting dates. Typically what gets put into the bunker, though, are late planting dates. But if you can get early planting and things like that, you'll end up with better quality and, again, higher yielding types of corn silage that you can put into that bunker with those early planting dates. Number 5, crop rotation. This is some of the easiest yield you can get. You can increase your corn yields about 10 to 19% when you rotate with, in this case, soybean, but I think it would be similar to any other crop, whether it be wheat or alfalfa or anything else. This rotation effect lasts for about 2 years if you've got a 2-year or more break. I know a lot of dairymen grow continuous corn year after year after year, or they might rotate into an alfalfa field. But again, this is really easy yield to get just by rotating your crop a little bit. And if you are a dairyman growing corn and alfalfa, you know, growing 3 years of alfalfa and then 2 years of corn and then coming back with wheat or alfalfa isn't a bad option. And you can increase, whenever you're doing your rotation, you increase the yield and ultimately the quality, I think, too, for all the crops involved that you're rotating with. This slide kind of shows this a little bit. This is a slide that the data is from 1993 to 2012. This is grain yield in here, but the same thing is going on. It's going to be influencing silage yield as well, too. This basically grows 5 years of soybeans, and then we start growing 5 years of corn. This is a first-year corn, second, third, fourth, and fifth. This is continuous corn, so this is almost 30 years of continuous corn in this bar here, and this is corn in a corn-soybean rotation. That first-year corn, following 5 years of beans, yields the same as corn in the corn-soybean rotation. The second year of corn, you still see a rotation effect because you had a 5-year break of beans into that second year. But by the third year, the rotation effect is gone. The rotation yield, or the yield of third, fourth, and fifth year corn, is the same as growing corn at 30 years of continuous corn. So again, that rotation effect lasts at most 2 years, and by the third year, you're at 30 years of continuous corn yield levels. And again, it's a 16 to 17% yield increase in this data set and 6% in the second year of corn in this particular data set. Number 6, pest management. Weed control is key, and timeliness is everything. Early season weed competition costs in terms of yield. And the data really is shown here. This is some data from Nebraska that basically grew Roundup Ready corn. They had different levels of nitrogen in here, from 0 to 210 pounds. But what's interesting here is when they went in and controlled the weeds at various times, the earlier they controlled those weeds, the lower the yield impact. Okay, and it was especially true under low nitrogen. I mean, as you delayed that weed control timing decision, you would really have more and more yield impacts the more you delayed it. So again, early weed control is important. Corn is very sensitive to weed pressure, again, especially in these early times here. And again, oftentimes we kind of delay things now lately with Roundup Ready a little bit. Pest management is also important in terms of insects. We're seeing a lot of insects changing their behavior a little bit, and again, you kind of got to know where you're at around the Corn Belt, but it's certainly an important thing. One of the things that I recommend to all growers is, I think a BT corn borer type of transgenic hybrid is a good hybrid to grow. That's one of those hybrids that just seems we have enough pressure from this particular pest that it's an important thing to have out there. Diseases is also important to be managing. Generally, though, we can control most of our diseases through good hybrid selection. In the northern part of the Corn Belt, we're seeing a lot of anthracnose, northern corn leaf blight. One of the questions that oftentimes comes along is growers will often say they see responses due to headline or some of the foliar fungicides that are out there. What I'll typically say, though, is that if you're seeing a response due to a fungicide, you're probably not doing a good job of selecting your hybrids, because we can control many of these diseases by selecting a good hybrid with a good disease package on there. And there's a lot of other ways we can control disease, and these are a few of the management things that can be done. But really the cheapest way to do it is through resistant cultivars. That's really the best way to control diseases in general for corn silage or corn grain production. Okay, another poll question here. Mike, you want to take it away?
We're ready to rock and roll here. We're going to be running short on time, so let's vote quickly here. Let's vote quickly. What is the most important forage quality trait for your silage hybrids? Milk per ton, milk per acre, NDFD, starch. Boy, this is a tough question. I got mine answered. We'll see how I'm not doing well. I'm not got a passing grade here. I'd be getting an F if the poll people were the instructors as far as that goes. Steve?
Yeah, what happened to the old good true and false question? This is
well, thank God Joe gave us the first question. Otherwise, I'd really be in deep trouble here. But I think I'm winning on this one. I think I'm winning. So let's shut this off because we're getting a little short on time here, Joe. So digest this.
Yep. Yeah. This is. I think milk per acre too is really, especially if you're growing from a land base. If you're a dairyman buying all your feed, then milk per ton should drive this decision, no question. But if you're growing it from your own land base, then milk per acre, if you want to get the return from the land, that'd be probably the best way to approach it. But again, there's a lot of ways to skin this cat, and everyone's got a little different opinion on things. But milk per acre relates more to that yield, milk per ton more to the quality, and of course NDFD and starch are getting very specific on quality aspects. So. Doesn't surprise me a bit with what people are thinking. Okay, real quickly here, I'm going to kind of really speed things up here a little bit. A few other things that affect yield and quality are plant density and row spacing. Generally for grain, what we see in Wisconsin is about 38,000 plants to the acre optimizes grain yield. But when we grow corn for silage, that forage yield continues to go up even into 43,000 plants per acre. Our best milk per ton is always at the lowest planting date, and as you increase it, it goes down. And so this trade-off of milk per ton and our quality and yield gives milk per acre basically a little bit around 40,000 plants to the acre. So generally what I tell growers is whatever you're at for grain, if you know that field is going to go into silage, so let's just say you're at 30,000 plants to the acre, I would increase that field, if you know it's going to be for silage, I would increase it about 2,000 to 3,000 plants per acre. Another aspect to this is row spacing. There's probably the Cadillac of studies was done by Michigan, and the reason it's a Cadillac of studies is they used one planter to plant 15, 22, and 30-inch rows, and they had 3 different heads to basically take that grain off and then also harvest corn silage. Here's what we see for the influence of row width on this. 30 down to 15 inches, basically yield increased from about a half a ton. Also grain yield increased about 7 bushels to the acre. And if we look at the quality, there's really no effect on quality with the change in row spacing. So you increase your forage yield about a half a ton or so by going to a narrower row spacing. Right now, there's a lot of interest, though, with twin rows. These high populations, there are some challenges, especially with blank ears and small ears. Industry's done a lot of work on measuring the effect of twin rows out there. Monsanto's measured about a 3-bushel increase. AgriGold has seen about a 4 to 5 bushel increase over single rows, but there are hybrid interaction. Pioneer is not measured much, only about less than a bushel per acre over with the twin rows. So again, it's kind of mixed in terms of what industry is seeing, but again, moving to that twin rows isn't a bad thing. It's just not a big jump. It's maybe only 2 or 3 bushels or so. Soil fertility, this isn't the place to cut costs. You want to make sure corn is a nitrogen-loving type of a crop, and what we recommend, though, is use the cheapest form of a nitrogen you can out there. With corn for grain or silage, you're removing quite a bit of phosphorus and potassium from the field when you cut corn silage or take grain off. And you've got to replace this. So every once in a while, you need to be putting on phosphate and potassium. And of course, a lot of that can come from dairy manure. Dairy manure has a lot of nutrients in it, and we can replace a lot of that on the field. A little bit about tillage. Tillage used to be about controlling weeds and seedbed preparation. Really, now it's not. And I think we can do a very good job of growing corn, especially if we're rotating. This slide here shows the effect of rotation and tillage. Not a lot of effect going on in those early years of corn, but as you go deeper into a continuous corn rotation, you need to do some tillage. So again, if you rotate, you don't need to do tillage. But more continuous corn, you need to do some tillage, and it's about a 10 or 8 to 11% yield increase just by doing a little bit of tillage out there. Finally, a few things about harvesting, the cutting height effects of silage yield and quality. Generally, as you raise your cutter bar on your silage chopper, you decrease yield. For every foot, you'll go down about 15%, but you increase your milk per ton or your quality because you're leaving the worst part of the stock out there in the field. So because of this yield quality trade-off, you only lose about 4% of your milk per acre. Okay, so raising your cutter bar a foot isn't really going to hurt you too much. I don't think you want to raise that cutter bar over the ear, but you do want to catch that ear as you're bringing it in. But again, it's not too bad of a way to increase that quality a little bit. The interesting thing here is about the moisture, though. The grain on corn silage is the driest part of the plant. So if you have a custom chopper coming to your farm and that grain is too wet, one way to dry it down a little bit is to raise that cutter bar, because the grain, again, is the driest part of the plant. So by raising that cutter bar, you can lower that moisture up to about 5 points by raising that cutter bar. I'm going to skip these next two slides here, or three, and I want to just talk a little bit about corn silage value and what it's worth and how we get at this a little bit. Right now it's costing about $600 to $750 an acre to grow corn, and you need to be able to recoup those costs if that field is sold for corn silage. Generally right now what we do mostly is sell corn for grain based on some sort of a estimate of the number of bushels in that corn silage. Generally, we're coming in at about 7.3 to 7.5 tons or bushels per ton of silage at 65% moisture. This is quite variable, though. We can see some environments as low as 4 and as high as 11, and we'll see hybrid differences. We'll see a lot of different effects going on out there. But in general, on average, this is typically what we see as far as grain equivalents per ton of silage with modern hybrids. It used to be 7 bushels per acre, but again, at these yield levels, this is where we see the value of corn silage right now. Finally, I'll just stop here. We got a little bit of time for questions, but I think, and I'm kind of a little biased here, but to be a good dairyman, I'm sure Mike will have some comments on this, but to be a good dairyman, you must first be a good agronomist, because producing good quality corn silage is really begins in the field, and as an agronomist, our growers, I think, struggle with selecting hybrids and timing that harvest a little bit. But there are a lot of other decisions that go into this, into producing high quality corn silage as well too. With that, I'll stop. We do have a website that you can subscribe to, and we publish a number of blog articles, and we got Twitter accounts and all this sort of a thing that goes on. And if you want to kind of follow us as we go through the season, we try to update things with the corn crop in Wisconsin at least. So with that, I'll stop and turn it back over to you, Mike. And
okay. Well, Joe, very good. As one of our people commented on, they said it was an excellent webinar, and I agree with that 100%. Let's click to our next PowerPoint if we can, Joe, and I will turn it over to Steve to kind of give us a wrap-up before we start the Q&A. Steve?
Okay. Thank you, Mike. And Joe will give you a chance to catch your breath here, and I just want to thank you for a great webinar. Really learned a lot of stuff, and I think it was very well done, very well organized, and I commend you for that. I also commend Kuhn for their support, sponsorship of the webinar today. And as always, our thanks to Mike Hutchins down there at the University of Illinois and Jim Baltz for their hosting and participation as well. Just a note to those, this webinar and all of the previous ones are available on the archives, hoardsdairyman.com. Click on the archive icon, or webinar icon rather, and you can find them. About almost 30,000 people have gone back and viewed, at least to some extent, past webinars. A survey will be coming to those of you listening today. We ask you to respond to your thoughts about this webinar. It'll help us provide future webinars that are of most benefit and value to you. And then a note, January 13th, starting our 4th year, feed efficiency, what's new in feed efficiency. Mike Hutchins will be the presenter, and Digistar LLC is going to be the sponsor of that. And with that, those comments, Mike, are there some questions?
Yes, there are. Joe, do you want to click one more PowerPoint, please? And we will continue to recognize our sponsors, because without those sponsors, I know this webinar would not be free. And I know we really appreciate that. Well, we have a number of good questions here, Joe. Here we go. Will a cover crop help reduce the yield penalty from lack of rotation?
I don't have data on that at all, but my gut tells me that no, it won't. One of the things that you do when you take on when you grow cover crops is you increase the risk of that corn crop the next year. So one of the common practices that we have in Wisconsin here is that depending if we have winter kill or things like that, growers will oftentimes take the first cutting of alfalfa and then plow down that alfalfa the first, second, third week in May, and then grow corn following that alfalfa crop. And usually it's a disaster. And I would expect the same sort of a thing going on with the cover crop, because what's happening is you use up a lot of the yield. Now, if you can kill that cover crop real early, before it uses water and before that crop gets going out there, then yeah, it might be beneficial. It could help with the rotation effect a little bit. But in that season, what's really driving that yield more than anything is water. And if you do grow a cover crop, the earlier you kill it or let the winter kill it, the better off it'll be.
Joe, you mentioned using the cheapest form of nitrogen. What are your thoughts on protected nitrogen?
Yeah, that again, I think in general the recommendation is to use the cheapest form, but what you're always trading off is being able to get that into the plant and having the plant be efficient in terms of its uptake. So some of these protected nitrogens are actually, if you're concerned about efficiency and you're concerned about being able to get that nitrogen into the plant and not have it denitrify or be lost to the atmosphere, then a protected form, some sort of a coated form, agrotane or a number of other products that are out there that will slow down the volatilization of nitrogen can oftentimes be an economical buy. But predicting that is difficult, and that's because it's so much dictated by the kind of season that you're going to have. So it's one of these answers that I have to give that, again, the cheapest form is the recommended way, but there are many situations where some sort of a pelleted or protected form of nitrogen would certainly have its place as well too. But you got to trade that off with the cost, certainly.
Another question has to do with kernel moisture. A number of places they actually grind up the whole plant. If we just analyze kernel moisture, would that give us enough window to give us an idea of when we should be harvesting versus doing the whole plant grind up with a shredder? Yeah,
it really doesn't, because we've been tracking, for example, what happens is that in our modern corn hybrids, we have something called the stay green trait, where the grain dries down to really almost harvestable moistures and the plant is still green. And but not every plant is that way. Some of the silage specific hybrids are not that way. They don't have that stay green trait. So if you're going to try to correlate Drydown, grain Drydown with silage Drydown, you better have a lot of experience with that individual hybrid, because to randomly go out there and try to determine that for an individual hybrid, it would be very difficult at best, because they're so different. You remember that one graph where you had some silage hybrids as dry as 50%, some silage hybrids as wet as 75%. They were all at 50% kernel milk line. But that just shows the great variation that can occur between hybrids within a field.
I think we'll answer this question. Came up here. It says, are these slides available as a PDF or as PowerPoint? Looking at Jim here, if you go to the recording, you'll see the voice and you'll see the PowerPoint, but you can't download it from that point. So there's no way you can download it, but you can see the PowerPoint if you want to look at the data and see the numbers as far as that goes. If you want to try to get that, you have to contact Joe, and I'll leave that up to his decision how he wants to handle that. You want to make a comment on that, Joe, or not really?
Well, I was going to say most of these slides are available on our website. So.
Okay, very good. Are there much differences in starch availability amongst the hybrids? And if so, how can I measure that?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I don't know about starch availability. Starch content, certainly there is. Starch availability, there is, because there's quite a bit of there's quite a few differences between hybrids, again, just due to the vitreous endosperm that's oftentimes present. Whether or not that makes any difference to the cow, though, is something you can probably answer a little bit better, Mike. But as I understand from what I've visited with Randy, you can either have starch digestion occurring in the rumen, but a lot of that starch digestion also occurs further down in the digestive tract of the cow. So even though there might be some very dramatic differences between hybrids for starch availability, they get kind of washed out as that kernel moves through but again, one way to influence that, of course, is through kernel processing and timing of that harvest and various things like that. Mike, I'm sure you might be able to add to that.
What I would add, though, is Dr. Randy Shaver is going to be online discussing that a little bit later on this year. So the good news is that we'll just lay that till Dr. Shaver gets online. And the answer is yes, there are some really significant differences as far as that goes. A weird question here, because I'm going to kill this word, but in discussion with growers about bee health and alternatives with the neonicotinoid issue, does that make any sense to you?
Neonicotinoid, yeah.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. There is not a lot of data to the neonicotinoids. The neonics are basically things like poncho, cruiser. They're seed treatments that go on to seed. And with a lot of our vacuum planters nowadays, a lot of that gets onto talc powder and gets discharge as you plant and as you go through the vacuuming or cleaning the vacuum out in a planter. There's no data to support whether or not the neonics are influencing bee colony collapse disorder or things like that. It's certainly one of the suspects out there, because bees are very sensitive to neonics. But as to whether or not it affects colony collapse disorder, I don't think we've been able to identify yet what is causing that. I think there's some other suspects out there, actually, that besides the neonics. But that was one that was proposed because bees are tremendously sensitive to the neonics, poncho, cruiser, seed treatments that are out there. So that's one of those I think you got to stay tuned on. I think they're getting closer, but nothing confirmed yet.
Well, Joe, you've done yeoman's job here, and we've had some general comments that we're just going to skip over at this point. I want to thank you very much for being on, and I'll turn the program back to Steve to wrap up if he's any closing comments, and thanks very much.
Thanks,
okay, Mike. Thank you, Mike, and again, Joe, thank you much for a great webinar. We really have received some great comments, and they're very deserved. And thanks to Kuhn for their sponsorship. Thanks to you, Mike and Jim Bolts, Mike Hutchins and Jim Bolts down at the University of Illinois. Hope you all are with us. On January 13th, the next webinar, Mike Hutchins will be talking about what's new in feed efficiency. That's all for now. Happy holidays to all of you, and we look forward to having you join us next year.